There's a police officer in my hometown people still talk about sometimes, though probably not for the reasons you'd expect. His name was Officer Miller, and for most of my childhood, everybody was at least a little afraid of him. Not because he was abusive or aggressive or one of those cops constantly screaming at people. Honestly, Officer Miller barely raised his voice at all. That was part of what made him intimidating. He carried himself with this strange level of control that made everybody around him instinctively stand up straighter. Even other officers seemed careful around him. Miller had been on the force for over 20 years by the time this story happened. He worked mostly night patrols downtown and apparently volunteered for the shifts nobody else wanted. Rainstorms, holidays, winter overnights, things like that. People said he slept maybe 4 hours a night at most. He lived alone in a small duplex near the edge of town after his divorce sometime in the late 90s. Nobody really knew much else about his personal life because Miller almost never discussed it. He wasn't rude exactly, just closed off, like somebody who learned a long time ago that emotions complicated things unnecessarily. Even the way he spoke sounded disciplined. Short sentences, calm tone, no wasted words. There was one diner waitress who once joked that Officer Miller ordered coffee the same way he probably read Miranda rights. Black, no sugar. That was apparently his exact order every single night for nearly 15 years. The strange thing, though, was that people trusted him deeply. If Miller showed up somewhere, things calmed down. Bar fights ended quicker. Drunk people cooperated. Nervous witnesses settled down. Not because he threatened anybody, because his composure made everybody else feel slightly embarrassed to lose theirs. At least that's how my father explained it. Then one October night, everything changed because of 7 puppies. It had been raining heavily most of the evening. One of those miserable cold rains where sidewalks shine under streetlights and everything smells faintly like wet concrete and exhaust. Miller was finishing up a patrol near the old textile district around 2 in the morning when he heard what he initially thought was birds somewhere behind a dumpster near an alleyway. Except birds don't usually cry like that. Miller later admitted the sound bothered him instantly because it sounded panicked, not loud, desperate. He followed the noise down the alley using his flashlight and eventually found a soaked cardboard box shoved beside a chain-link fence behind a closed laundromat. Inside were 7 tiny puppies piled on top of each other, shaking violently from the cold. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. One of them was so weak it apparently barely lifted its head when the flashlight hit the box. Now here's the thing people found funny later. Officer Miller genuinely did not know what to do. Not with armed suspects, not with emergencies, and not with danger. With puppies, apparently he just stood there in the rain staring at the box for a solid 30 seconds, like his brain stopped functioning entirely. Eventually he radioed dispatch and awkwardly asked if animal control was still operating at that hour. They weren't, so dispatch basically told him, "Congratulations, they're your problem until morning." One of the officers later said Miller sounded more stressed during that radio call than during actual armed standoffs. He ended up placing the entire box carefully into the back seat of his patrol car. For the first time in department history, apparently, Officer Miller spent the remainder of a night shift driving around with 7 whining puppies buckled into police blankets behind him. And according to another officer, Miller kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, like he was transporting explosives. The next problem came when he brought them home, because once again, Miller had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He owned almost nothing remotely useful for caring for animals. No pet food, no bowls, no blankets besides old police extras. At one point, he apparently fed the puppies bits of scrambled eggs off paper towels because that was the only thing he could think of at 3 in the morning. The following day, he showed up at a pet supply store still wearing his uniform after working all night and bought what employees later described as basically the entire puppy section. Formula, toys, tiny collars, bedding, training pads. One cashier said Miller looked deeply uncomfortable the entire time, like he was trying to defuse a bomb using instructions written in another language. Things became significantly more chaotic after that, because 7 puppies inside a small duplex is apparently what psychologists would classify as a complete collapse of domestic order. Miller's life transformed almost overnight. The man who once ironed his shirts with military precision now regularly had puppy food smeared across his sleeves before sunrise. His perfectly quiet house suddenly sounded like constant tiny disasters. Whining, barking, scratching, things falling over. Neighbors later said they started seeing Miller outside at absurd hours looking completely exhausted while trying to herd 7 puppies through wet grass before work. One puppy named Moose became especially attached to him. Moose followed Miller everywhere. Bathroom, kitchen, front porch. There's a body cam clip one of the officers secretly recorded where Moose somehow climbs halfway up Miller's uniform pants during a briefing, while Miller continues discussing paperwork, completely seriously, without acknowledging it once. The entire department apparently lost their minds laughing afterward. That's another thing people noticed. Miller slowly started laughing more, not huge dramatic laughter, just little cracks in his composure that almost seemed accidental. One officer said the first time he heard Miller genuinely laugh was after one of the puppies fell asleep inside Miller's police boot during a shift briefing. Apparently, Miller looked down at the boot for a few seconds before quietly muttering, "Well, that complicates things." Everybody in the room started laughing, including Miller himself, and weirdly, once people saw that side of him, it became impossible to fully fear him anymore. That transformation spread through town surprisingly fast. Soon everybody knew about the puppies. Children started waving at Miller more. People brought chew toys to the station. One elderly woman knitted tiny dog sweaters for all 7 puppies, though Miller reportedly tried refusing them at first because he claimed sweaters were operationally unnecessary. The sweaters won. There was also something deeply funny about how seriously Miller approached puppy care. He made feeding schedules, medical charts, bathroom rotation systems. At one point, he apparently built an actual corkboard in his kitchen, tracking each puppy's weight progression like an ongoing criminal investigation. But beneath all the humor, people slowly realized something else too. Miller genuinely loved those dogs, probably more openly than he'd loved anything in years. You could see it in tiny moments. The way he automatically bent down to wipe mud off before entering the house. The way he carried sleeping puppies carefully against his chest after late-night feedings. The way he stopped taking overtime shifts because he needed to get home. That sentence alone shocked people who knew him, because Officer Miller had always acted like there was nothing waiting for him at home before. There was one winter night where Miller responded to a bad highway accident during a snowstorm and ended up working nearly 16 straight hours. Another officer offered to check on the puppies while Miller finished paperwork downtown. Miller apparently declined immediately and drove home himself through dangerous roads afterward because, in his exact words, "They've already been abandoned once." That line spread around town for years because I think everybody understood he wasn't only talking about dogs anymore. Eventually, the puppies grew large enough for adoption, and surprisingly, that became emotionally difficult for Miller, much harder than anybody expected. One by one, local families adopted them. Miller personally interviewed every household himself too, which people joked felt more intense than applying for government security clearance. One family later said Miller spent 20 minutes asking where the dog would sleep during thunderstorms. By the time only Moose remained, the entire department already knew what was happening. Moose wasn't going anywhere. Honestly, the dog basically belonged to Miller from the beginning. The final puppy adoption happened nearly 6 months after that rainy alleyway discovery. By then, Miller's entire personality had shifted in subtle ways. Not softer exactly, just more reachable. He smiled more, talked longer, attended neighborhood events occasionally. One summer afternoon, there was even a photo in the local newspaper showing Officer Miller sitting cross-legged in a park surrounded by children while Moose slept across his lap. Most people who knew the old Miller would have thought the image was fake, but maybe my favorite part of this whole story happened years later after Miller retired. One of the younger officers visited him at home and described seeing something unexpected taped beside the refrigerator in Miller's kitchen. It was the original feeding schedule he made for the puppies all those years earlier. Old, faded, corners curling. The officer asked him why he still kept it. Miller apparently looked over at Moose sleeping near the couch before answering, because that's when the house stopped feeling empty. And honestly, I think that might have been the first completely honest thing anybody ever heard him say. On the morning of July 2nd, a quiet coastal town woke up to what everyone believed was the most important emergency in its history. Sirens were wailing, fishing boats were launching, marine biologists were scrambling onto helicopters, families were sprinting toward the shoreline with bed sheets and buckets of water, hearts pounding, ready to do whatever it took. Within 45 minutes, over 300 people had mobilized into a full-scale rescue operation. Drones were in the air. Coast Guard vessels were cutting through the waves. A local news crew was live on air. The mayor was on the phone with wildlife authorities. The only problem, there was nothing to save. Not a single living creature was in that water. What 300 panicked, well-meaning, genuinely heroic people had rushed to rescue was a collection of inflatable pool loungers, gray, dolphin-shaped, premium vinyl, made in China, that had escaped from a nearby resort's midnight pool party and drifted quietly into the bay overnight. This is the story of the greatest accidental rescue mission a town has ever launched, and it is one of the most beautiful things that has ever happened. It started, as most disasters do in the modern age, with a blurry photograph. At 6:14 in the morning, a jogger named Marcus was running his usual route along the coastal path when he spotted something in the water. Gray shapes, dozens of them, bobbing rhythmically in the choppy early morning bay, dorsal fins breaking the surface in the morning mist. He stopped, he stared, he pulled out his phone. The photograph he posted 11 seconds later was not a good photograph. It was taken with shaking hands, through sea spray, at considerable distance, in the specific gray flatness of early morning coastal light that makes everything look exactly like everything else. But it didn't matter, because what the caption said was enough. Dolphins, hundreds of them, stranded in the bay, someone call someone. Within 4 minutes, the post had been shared 200 times. Within 8 minutes, it had reached the local emergency coordinator's phone. Within 12 minutes, the first calls were going out to marine rescue volunteers. Within 20 minutes, the town's emergency broadcast system, designed for hurricanes and chemical spills, had activated for the first time in 7 years. Nobody stopped to verify. Nobody zoomed in on the photograph. Nobody asked whether the gray shapes in the water moved with the particular deliberate motion of living animals, or whether they bobbed with the particular passive compliance of objects that simply went wherever the current took them. There was no time. There were dolphins, and they needed help. What happened in the next 45 minutes is genuinely one of the most impressive things a small community has ever done. The fishing fleet launched first. 7 boats, crewed by men and women who had been pulling nets since before sunrise, turned their vessels around without a moment of hesitation and headed toward the coordinates Marcus had shared. They brought nets, buoys, ropes, and decades of experience reading the water. The kayakers came next. 14 of them, from the town's paddling club, hit the water in under 10 minutes from the first alert, a personal best they would later note with some pride despite the circumstances. The paddleboarders followed, then the Coast Guard vessel, then a research boat from the marine biology station 20 minutes up the coast, whose director had received the alert and immediately dispatched 2 of her team members with a drone and a full stranding response kit. On the beach, the scene was something that would take a novelist several chapters to properly describe. 300 people had gathered at the shoreline, organized by nobody in particular, but functioning somehow as a single coherent unit. People with no training were being given roles by people with training. Sheets and towels had appeared from nowhere, the instinct to keep stranded dolphins wet being apparently hardwired into anyone who has ever watched a nature documentary. Someone had driven their pickup truck directly onto the sand and was unloading coolers of water. The drone went up at 6:47 a.m. The operator, a marine biologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, guided it out over the bay toward the cluster of gray shapes, watching the live feed on her tablet. She was the first person to see the truth. She looked at the screen. She looked again. She zoomed in. She put the tablet down. She picked it up again. She zoomed in further. "Oh no," she said quietly, to nobody in particular. The lead boat reached the pod at 6:52 a.m. Captain Dave Riley had been fishing this bay for 31 years. He had seen dolphins in these waters hundreds of times. He knew what a stranded dolphin looked like. The labored breathing, the disorientation, the heartbreaking stillness of an animal that has somehow found itself in a place it cannot escape from. He cut the engine 20 meters out from the nearest shape, the way you do when you're approaching a living animal. You don't want to panic. He picked up the long-handled net pole used for guiding distressed animals. He reached out toward the nearest gray fin. The pole made contact. The dolphin gave a small, cheerful squeak and bobbed gently away on the current. Dave Riley is a man of considerable experience and composure, but what he said in that moment, according to the 3 crew members standing behind him, was not composure. It was a single word that cannot be repeated here, followed by a long silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of a grown man beginning to laugh. He reached out again. This time his hand closed around the fin. It was warm from the morning sun. It was smooth in the specific way that high-quality vinyl is smooth, and stamped just below the waterline, in small black letters, were the words, "Inflatable Leisure Products, Made in China." He held it up for his crew to see. Over the radio, Dr. Chen's voice came through, very carefully controlled, so the drone footage is showing what appears to be approximately 60 inflatable dolphin-shaped pool loungers, premium grade. I think there's a price tag still attached to one of them. The silence on the radio lasted almost 5 full seconds. Then someone started laughing. then someone else. Then the radio dissolved entirely into the sound of 300 people's mourning going in a completely unexpected direction. Here is what investigators later pieced together. The Shoreline Grand Resort, approximately 2 kilometers up the coast, had hosted a summer gala the previous evening. A midnight pool party for 200 guests with a Hawaiian theme, featuring among its decorations 60 premium inflatable dolphin loungers imported from a specialty party supplier. At some point between midnight and 2 in the morning, a combination of wind, an inadequately secured pool gate, and the particular fluid dynamics of 60 inflatable objects in a body of water connected by a channel to the open bay had resulted in the entire fleet drifting silently out to sea overnight. The resort's events manager, who had arrived to work at 7 that morning to find 3 Coast Guard vessels, 14 kayaks, a drone, and the entire town of approximately 300 people gathered at the waterfront, needed a moment to process what she was being told before she could respond. She would later issue a formal apology. She would also pay to have all 60 loungers retrieved from the bay and responsibly disposed of, which required 2 boats, 4 hours, and a very large cargo net. But here is the thing that everyone involved in that morning kept coming back to when they talked about it afterward. Nobody, not a single person, regretted being there. Not the fishermen who turned their boats around, not the kayakers who hit the water in 10 minutes flat, not the people who drove to the beach with bed sheets, not Dr. Chen, whose drone footage would become one of the most watched videos of the year for reasons nobody had anticipated, not even Captain Dave Riley, who held up a vinyl dolphin fin on live local news and laughed until his eyes watered, because what that morning proved, beyond any possible argument, was that this town would show up. That when something needed saving, or appeared to need saving, or even vaguely resembled something that might possibly need saving in certain lighting conditions, 300 people would be on the beach within 45 minutes with sheets and water and boats and drones and 31 years of fishing experience, ready to do whatever was needed. That is not a small thing. That is actually an extraordinary thing. 3 weeks after what the local paper somewhat inevitably named the inflatable incident, the town held a meeting. It was called, officially, a Community Marine Emergency Preparedness Forum. It was attended by more people than any town meeting in recent memory, which the mayor observed was somewhat ironic given the circumstances. But what came out of that meeting was real. The rapid mobilization that had happened by accident, the network of boat captains and kayakers and volunteers and marine biologists that had assembled in under an hour, was formalized into an actual emergency response system, a proper one, with a coordination protocol, a communication chain, a roster of volunteers, and a direct line to IFAW's Marine Mammal Rescue Team on Cape Cod. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose drone had been the first to discover the truth and who had handled that discovery with remarkable professional dignity, became the coordinator of the new network. She organized a 6-hour training day for anyone who wanted to be involved in genuine marine animal rescue. How to approach a stranded dolphin, how to keep it wet and comfortable while waiting for expert help, how to read its breathing and body language, what to do, and critically, what not to do. 47 people attended, including Captain Dave Riley, who sat in the front row and asked very good questions and did not mention the vinyl fin once. The network has since responded to 3 actual strandings: a juvenile harbor seal in September, 2 common dolphins in November, and a leatherback sea turtle in April of the following year. In all 3 cases, the rapid response that the community had accidentally rehearsed on a collection of pool toys made a genuine difference to the outcome. The turtle was named Gala. She was released back into the ocean 12 days after she was found. A tracking tag showed she had swum 300 miles south within a month. There is a version of this story that is just a funny video. 60 inflatable dolphins drifting out to sea in the night, 300 people mobilizing for a rescue, 1 fisherman holding up a vinyl fin with an expression that no camera could have planned. That version is genuinely funny. It deserved every one of its 40 million views. But there is another version of this story, and it is the one that stays with you. It is the version where a town was given a chance to find out what it was actually made of, what it would do when something needed help, when there was no time to think and no guarantee of success and a slight but real possibility of looking ridiculous in front of everyone you've ever met. And the answer, it turned out, was everything. They would do everything. 300 people on a beach at 6 in the morning with bed sheets and water buckets and boats and drones for something that turned out to be made in China. Imagine what they'll do for the real thing. It's just after sunrise. The tide is already creeping in. and on a quiet stretch of rocky coastline, a 17-year-old boy is about to do something he never planned for, something with no training, no equipment, and no time to think twice. All he has is a small blue plastic bucket, the kind you'd find forgotten in a garden shed. In the next few minutes, that bucket is going to mean the difference between life and death for a stranded baby seal. This is the story of how an ordinary morning walk turned into a race against the ocean itself. Jake wasn't supposed to be on the beach that early. He told his parents he was going for a run before school, the kind of half-truth teenagers tell when they really just want a few minutes of quiet before the day gets loud. The coastline here is beautiful, but unforgiving. Jagged rock pools, slippery kelp beds, a tide that doesn't ask permission before it comes in. It simply arrives, faster than most people expect, swallowing the exposed rock in under an hour. Jake had walked this beach 100 times. He knew its rhythms, or at least he thought he did. What he didn't know was that today, the tide was bringing someone that needed his help. It was the sound that stopped him first, a high, raspy bark, almost like a cough, coming from a cluster of rocks about 30 meters ahead. He almost walked past it. Almost, but something made him climb down toward the noise, and there, wedged between two slick boulders, was a baby seal, small, exhausted, barely raising its head as the waves lapped closer with every passing minute. It had likely been separated from its mother during the night, washed into this rocky pocket by a current it had no power to fight. Now it was trapped, too weak to climb out, and directly in the path of a rising tide that would, within the hour, completely submerge that crevice. Jake's heart started pounding. He pulled out his phone. No signal, of course not. He was completely alone, with a frightened, struggling animal, and a clock that was already running out. Here's what most people don't realize about a stranded seal. You can't just pick one up and run. Wild seals bite hard. Their jaws are built for crushing shellfish and slippery fish. A panicked one will absolutely defend itself against anything that looks like a threat, including a well-meaning teenager. Wildlife experts are unanimous on this point. Direct contact with bare hands is dangerous for both the rescuer and the animal. So Jake stood there for a moment, frozen, replaying every nature documentary he'd ever half-watched. He needed distance between his hands and those teeth. He needed something to scoop, not grab. That's when he remembered the bucket. Earlier that week, he'd left it on the beach after helping his little sister build a sandcastle. It was sitting exactly where he'd abandoned it, half-buried, sun-faded, utterly unremarkable. In that moment, it became the only tool standing between this animal and the sea. The water was already at his ankles when he reached the bucket. He waded back toward the rocks, the cold cutting through his sneakers, salt spray stinging his eyes. The seal pup let out another bark, sharper this time, more afraid. Jake slowed down. He'd seen enough to know that sudden movement would only panic it further, maybe even cause it to thrash itself deeper into the crevice. So he knelt, slowly, carefully. He lowered the bucket at an angle, edge first, the way you'd guide a frightened cat into a carrier, talking to it the entire time, low, steady, nonsense words that meant nothing except, "I'm not going to hurt you." The first attempt failed. The seal lurched sideways, slapping against the rock, more tangled than before. The water was climbing past his knees now. He had one shot left before the gap between the boulders would be too deep to safely reach into it all. Jake repositioned. This time, instead of scooping from the front, he angled the bucket from behind the pup's body, using the natural slope of the rock as a ramp. He pushed gently. The seal, exhausted and out of options, finally stopped fighting the bucket and simply slid inside, curling into the small space like it somehow understood this strange plastic container wasn't the enemy. For a second, neither of them moved. Boy and seal, both soaked, both breathing hard, separated by nothing but a few millimeters of blue plastic. Then, Jake stood up, lifted the bucket against his chest, and started climbing back over the rocks, now slick with incoming seawater, toward dry sand. He didn't carry the seal far. Wildlife rescue guidelines are clear. Stranded marine mammals should be released back into the ocean as close to the original location as safely possible, away from the immediate danger, not transported elsewhere. So Jake found a stretch of open beach, just clear of the rocks, where the water was calm and shallow. He tipped the bucket gently onto its side. The seal hesitated for a moment, disoriented, blinking against the morning light, and then, in one smooth motion, slipped out and into the surf. It paused once, looking back toward the shore. Then it dove and disappeared beneath the waves. Jake stood there, soaked, holding an empty plastic bucket, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly, just relief. The quiet, overwhelming kind. There's no dramatic ending here, no news cameras, no medal, no viral fame in the moment it actually happened. Jake walked home, told his parents what happened over breakfast, and went to school like normal. But experts who study human-wildlife encounters often point to stories exactly like this one as proof of something important. You don't need expensive equipment, formal training, or perfect conditions to make a difference. Sometimes you just need to notice, to actually stop and listen when something doesn't sound right, and to be willing to act with whatever happens to be in reach. In Jake's case, that was a forgotten plastic bucket, a stranded seal, a rising tide, a teenager who almost walked past. It's easy to imagine heroism as something big and loud, but more often, it looks like this: quiet, fast, and a little bit improvised. A kid kneeling in cold water, talking nonsense to a frightened animal, because some quiet part of him refused to just keep walking. If you ever find yourself face to face with a stranded marine animal, remember, don't touch it directly, give it space, and call your local wildlife rescue if you can. But never underestimate what a little quick thinking, and whatever's lying around, can do.